magazines or newspapers, or even full-fledged books that are dedicated to the qualities of effective leaders. And I don't know about you, but whenever I read these books, the qualities seem very generic and almost common sense. Things like leaders should be innovative and creative, or should be able to communicate effectively to their teams. These all seem like very basic things that all human beings should do in order to maintain successful lives. Recently, I've had to take on a leadership role as part of a club I'm involved in at UC Berkeley. The club is called Neurotech at Berkeley, and in this club, I lead a group of about 10 people, and we're on a project where we're building a set of goggles that can actually track your eye movements. The idea is that if we can track your eye movements, like your blinks and your left and right movements, we can use these to control, let's say, a robot car directly with your eyes. It sounds sci-fi, but that's our goal right now. I'd like to talk about some lessons that I learned through this leadership experience that are almost never mentioned in these common books or articles on leadership. The first lesson I want to talk about is delegating responsibility. As a leader, I think it's very easy to want to hold control of all aspects of a project because it's, in a sense, your baby. You have a vision and a goal for how the project should turn out, and it's hard to relinquish control of that project to different team members and let them take their own progress with that. Ultimately, though, I think this is a very important and necessary step as a leader, because if you get too wrapped up in the nitty-gritty details of a project, you'll never be able to step back and have the 30,000-foot view to see where the project should head in the next week or the next month or the next year. And having that longer-term perspective is what ultimately makes you effective as a leader. So it's necessary to delegate responsibility to other people. I think there's an important disclaimer here, though, which a lot of leaders may be uncomfortable with. Even if you delegate responsibility to other team members, you still have to be willing to accept responsibility for their mistakes. As a leader, it's ultimately your project. So when you present this project to an external stakeholder or someone in a higher ranking position, if there's a mistake that was made by another team member, it's ultimately still up to you to absorb that responsibility and explain what went wrong and what could have been done better. I think this is important for two reasons. Number one, it shows that external stakeholder that you're an effective leader by recognizing your own team's faults and by accepting responsibility. But perhaps even more importantly, this is important to uphold your own team's morale. It's a lot easier to have a nice team that is able to bond around a collective project when they see a leader who can stand up for them and guard them when they make mistakes, rather than leaving them vulnerable to be scapegoats for a mistake that was made. The second lesson I learned, which I think is very interesting, is that good leaders should be able to create other leaders within their own team. What I mean by this is I tried an experiment this semester where instead of just having me and another person as two leaders of this group and having everyone else work under us, I decided to create 3 different sub-teams within this whole team. And the idea was that each of them would have a sub-lead in a sense, but they'd be free and able to do any kind of modifications they wanted to do to their own project. So there would be a little bit of freedom in that kind of organizational structure. What I realized is that this kind of structure not only lifted some burden from me in that I didn't have to have responsibility over every part of the project, but these sub-teams actually expanded their role beyond something that I never would have imagined. For example, one of the sub-teams I created was one that was meant to do research on how to interpret the electrical activity of the eyes. So their job was to study papers and understand, how can we match a blink to a specific electrical pattern or an eye movement to the right or the left to a different electrical pattern. That was my original intent for that team. But now that team has actually expanded to look at publishing a literature review of all the different literature that's out there on this topic, and then actually creating a footprint for our club in the scientific community. So this is a great example where my original vision was expanded beyond something that I never would have implemented in the first place. So I think that effective leaders should be able to inspire other people in their own team to become their own leaders in a sort of way. I don't think effective leaders would be the ones to monopolize this idea of leadership and let everyone else only be pawns in their game who can carry out their vision. I think it's important for the morale of the other team members and the productivity of the whole team if other people can come up with their own agendas and implement their own ideas that are different from what the original intent may have been. The final lesson that I want to talk about is kind of on the other side of the spectrum, which is that I think good leaders should be open to new ideas, but being too open to new ideas can also be dangerous. For example, In a lot of different projects, it's important that the team meets a consistent schedule or set of checkpoints to ensure a successful completion of the project. There may be other ideas that are proposed along the way, and in that moment, they can seem very sexy or appealing. But in the long term, they might not be very productive for your team. They may derail progress or lead you down a path that's not going to be productive for you in the long term. So as a leader, you have a choice to make. You have to accept these ideas from your team members and acknowledge their own innovation and creativity, but you also have to have that 30,000-foot view and say that even though your ideas are good and they may be implemented in a good way in the future, they're simply not the right step to take right now. Now, this was especially interesting for me because in a corporate structure, this is very easy to implement. You have a clear organizational structure and a chain of command where certain higher-ranking people have a natural authority to dictate the way that a project can go. But in our case, where we're all just students of different age levels and different grades, there's not really a clear organizational authority that's already implemented. So it's very difficult for one person to say, I have the 30,000-foot view, and I have the right vision that should be implemented, whereas your ideas are not meant to be implemented right now. So this is something that I struggled with initially, but I think is an important step for all leaders to understand and acknowledge that it's part of their role. I want to conclude by giving a nice analogy that I think describes this whole idea of lessons in leadership. I was reading about how presidential candidates are really interesting from a psychological perspective because they always have this balance between humility and hubris. A lot of presidential candidates have these grand visions of how their America should be. They have very concrete but large-scale plans of how they can cement their status in history. For example, President Obama talked very early on about fundamentally transforming America. And President Lyndon Johnson had a very clear idea of this great society that he would create to upend the existing society that was in America at the time. And these kind of statements can seem very arrogant and very hubris-like because these people are assuming that they can lead a grand vision for millions of Americans across the country. But at the same time, they need to have the humility to delegate responsibility to other people in their staff and understand that they're not the only leaders. They can foster the growth of other leaders within their organization to promote the collective welfare of the country or the organization that they're leading. So I think there's important lessons to be learned here, and it can be a very good learning experience to try out a leadership experience like I did. So thank you.